We are built to move. You specifically. Whether you spend your days glued to a desk or constantly traveling, the deep current of human history flows in one direction, forward and outward. Our success, our very survival, was never guaranteed by standing still. It was guaranteed by leaving the comfortable for the unknown. Look at the history we usually tell ourselves. It's a highlight reel of restless motion. Leaving Africa, crossing the Middle East, island hopping to Australia, pushing deep into the Siberian cold. Every ancestor you had was a person who took a terrifying, often deadly leap of faith into a world they couldn't possibly map. The drive for the horizon, the obsession with what's over the next ridge, that isn't just curiosity. It is the core, evolutionary mandate of our species. So, when we look at the moment humanity reached its final, greatest physical barrier, the colonization of the Americas, we expect the most glorious chapter of this relentless movement. We expect the culmination of the human spirit of exploration. We expect pioneers running hot, obsessed with claiming every last mile of the empty continent. But the story we find in the dirt, the story told by the lithics and the campfire remnants, is not glorious. It is slow, quiet, and profoundly unsettling. It is the story of the Ghost March, the moment the human race, for the first and perhaps only time, lost the will to keep going. Imagine, if you will, the commitment. We are talking about groups of people, the original pioneering waves, often referred to as Paleo-Indians, who endured conditions that would kill all of us instantly. They navigated the shifting frozen landscape of Beringia, the land bridge that occasionally connected Siberia and Alaska during periods of lower sea levels. Or perhaps they pushed through the treacherous coastal route, navigating by boat along the jagged, icy shorelines of the North Pacific. They didn't do this for fun. They did it because following the massive game animals, the mammoths, the mastodons, the giant bison, was the only way to survive. Every step they took was a colossal act of faith. They were walking into an ecological void. They had no maps, no satellite imaging, no historical knowledge of what awaited them. They had only their expertly crafted tools, their intimate knowledge of ice and stone, and the deeply ingrained pathological need to keep going. When they finally broke through the suffocating choke point, whether it was the land corridor between the melting Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets, or the initial coastal landing on the Pacific Northwest, they stepped into a world untouched by human hands. Think about that moment. Every continent they had ever known, from Africa to Asia, was, in some measure, already marked by generations of human presence. But this land, this entire hemisphere, was pristine. It was an ecological explosion of resources, untapped game, and endless, terrifyingly limitless space. It was the ultimate prize, the final frontier on Earth. What would you do? You would run. You would exploit that emptiness. You would push south until you hit the Southern Ocean, claiming every valley and every mountain range in the name of your people. You would scatter, diversify, and innovate furiously to adapt to the staggering range of environments, from the dense rainforests of the north to the desert plateaus of the south. And that, initially, is exactly what happened. The archaeological record shows an initial burst of speed. Suddenly, we find signature tool technologies, like the distinctive fluted points, spreading rapidly across North America, suggesting a phenomenal, almost unbelievable pace of movement. From Alaska, deep into the American South and Central America, and then hurtling toward the tip of South America. It was a sprint that defined the final phase of human global colonization. It proves beyond doubt that these people were the most driven, most resourceful explorers history has ever known. They crossed 2 continents in a geological heartbeat, and then they stopped. Not all of them, of course. The spearhead continued south, settling Patagonia around 14,000 to 13,000 years ago. But behind that spearhead, something fundamental changed. A vast number of these pioneering populations, having endured the worst environment the world could throw at them, having crossed continents, having finally found paradise, stopped moving, and critically seemed to stop wanting to move. We begin to see the formation of what archaeologists call stable, localized traditions. We're talking about groups who settled generation after generation into extraordinarily specific ecological niches. They found a river, a perfect valley, a specific high desert basin, and they decided, this is it. We are done. You have to understand the profound departure this was from the human script. These regions were never at capacity. There was always another valley over the ridge, another mountain pass leading to new hunting grounds. The continent was essentially empty. Yet, the relentless drive, the forward momentum that had defined the previous 40,000 years of human history, evaporated. Look at the regions of the Great Basin in North America, or certain parts of the Pacific Northwest after the initial megafauna hunters passed through. We find evidence of incredible technological precision in their localized toolkits. They were brilliant survivors, but their territory stopped expanding. They settled into patterns that would last, in some places, for 10,000 years. 10,000 years in one place. You live, you die, your children live, your children's children die, all within the same hunting radius, the same familiar watershed. And all that time, the infinite empty wilderness stretched out just beyond their immediate territory, beckoning. We look at this archaeological evidence and we immediately jump to logical conclusions. The environment must have stabilized, and they had everything they needed. They were successful, so why take the risk? This is the standard academic explanation, and it is entirely insufficient because it ignores the deep psychological cost of the journey. It ignores the very nature of human ambition. No other human population on Earth, at the peak of its migratory success, found a vast, uninhabited continent and then collectively agreed to pull the emergency brake on exploration. This wasn't just survival. It was a psychological retreat. What could have happened on that long, terrible journey, or in those first terrifying years of endless isolation, that made these people look at the boundless opportunity of the Americas and conclude that the best thing to do was simply huddle together and stop moving? What trauma, what discovery, what deep existential weariness convinced humanity's greatest explorers to transform their march of conquest into a ghost march of permanent, heartbreaking stasis? We know they paused. We know they settled. But the reason they quit the greatest exploration in history is buried under 10 millennia of silence, waiting for us to dig up the melancholy truth. And the deepest part of that truth is that if you trace their journeys backward, you find something even stranger than the settled people. You find the places they walked away from, and you realize they didn't stop at the end of the line. They stopped right at the beginning. We talked about the pause, the moment humanity hit the brakes. Now, let's dig into where they paused, because the geography tells a story of terrifying constraint, not boundless opportunity. When you look at a modern map of North America, the continent seems to yawn open, beckoning exploration. But the people who walked out of Siberia and onto the land bridge we call Beringia weren't walking into a blank slate. They were walking into a fortress made of ice. We have to adjust our mental map. For hundreds of thousands of years, two colossal ice sheets dominated North America. The Laurentide, stretching across the east, and the Cordilleran, hugging the mountains in the west. These things were miles high, scraping the bedrock, blocking everything. They were the ultimate geographical no trespassing sign. The land bridge itself, Beringia, was not a frozen ocean trek, but a vast, dry, wind-scoured steppe, a cold grassland supporting hardy megafauna. Our ancestors crossed it not in a rush, but over millennia, following the bison and the woolly mammoths into the new continent. But once they were here, the walls closed in. They were stuck, confined between the Pacific Ocean on one side and the monstrous glacier complex on the other. For decades, historians focused on the ice-free corridor, the legendary gap that was supposed to have opened up between the Laurentide and Cordilleran sheets, stretching south through what is now Alberta and Saskatchewan. We imagined humanity patiently waiting for the doors to swing open and then streaming through a neatly prepared, ice-rimmed path to the south. But here's where the scientific consensus forces us to confront a grittier, sadder truth, the kind of truth that doesn't make for clean documentary footage. Genetic and ecological data now suggests that even when that corridor opened, around 13,000 years ago, it was likely a sterile, starved landscape. Picture a funnel made of rock and meltwater, devoid of plants and animals for perhaps hundreds of miles. To walk that path was not migration, it was suicide. The current, more widely accepted theory, the one that requires us to grant these ancient people far more ingenuity and pain, is the coastal route hypothesis. It's far more likely, the archaeology tells us, that the earliest human groups used sophisticated knowledge of the coastlines, maybe even basic watercraft, to hopscotch down the Pacific edge. They would have moved not as a conquering army, but as small, desperate pockets of specialists, hugging the shoreline, surviving off marine resources, moving from tiny ecological niche to tiny ecological niche, always shadowed by the crushing weight of the ice. Either way, coastal crawl or sterile corridor dash, the result was the same. A fundamental human shift took place. The vast American continent, this potential Eden, became a cage. The pressure built, the movement stopped. And when we trace the archaeological record of this great stasis, we find the overwhelming evidence of this psychological halt, the people we call Clovis. The name Clovis isn't a tribe or an empire, it's a toolkit. It is the signature artifact of humanity's great American pause, appearing almost simultaneously across North America around 13,500 years ago, and then, just as suddenly, vanishing about 700 years later. If you've ever seen a Clovis point, and we have found thousands of them, you recognize its immediate sophistication. It's not just a rock sharpened to a point. It is an artifact of precise, specialized engineering. Long, symmetrical, needle-sharp, and most importantly, featuring a distinctive concave groove, a flute, carved into the base. This flute allowed the point to be securely slotted and lashed into a wooden spear shaft, creating the most deadly, reliable hunting weapon ever devised by humanity up to that point. These Clovis people were masters. They were the undisputed apex predators of a hostile melting world. They were using their genius to perfect the machinery of killing. They were, almost certainly, the people who were responsible for taking down the colossal megafauna that defined Ice Age America, the woolly mammoths, the giant bison, the mastodons. But here is the melancholic irony of the Clovis culture, the one that tells us everything we need to know about their lost morale, their tools, their system, were perfectly homogeneous. Think about that. From the temperate forests of the Carolinas to the arid deserts of Arizona, we find virtually identical Clovis points. We see very little regional variation, very little creative divergence. This isn't the pattern of an expanding, fluid, constantly adapting migratory culture where groups develop localized technologies based on specific needs. This is the pattern of rigidity. This is the hallmark of a people who found one thing that worked, one specific way to survive, and clung to it with the existential terror of someone who knows what happens when you let go. They had perfected the solution to their northern struggle, and then they repeated it endlessly without moving forward. They were no longer explorers. They were technicians of survival. Imagine the psychological landscape of that existence. You are part of a people whose very identity is movement, defined by the journey itself. A people whose ancestors walked out of Africa and conquered Asia, driven always by the imperative to see what lies beyond the next ridge. And now, you are stuck here, perfecting the deadly geometry of a spear point, watching the glaciers retreat just fast enough to expose new, uncertain land. Why? Why not push south immediately into the endless, unexploited resources of Central and South America? Why establish a continent-spanning technological uniform culture that suggests stasis rather than conquest? The answer, etched into the fluted bases of those spear points, is that the fear of the unknown finally surpassed the curiosity of the human spirit. They had paid too high a price for their journey onto the continent, and the isolation was too profound. They were exhausted by endless risk. They stopped being the agents of chaos and became the defenders of order. The order of the kill. And then, just as they perfected their system of survival, something catastrophic happened. Something so vast, so sudden, that it shattered not just their culture, but the entire continent they inhabited, forcing them to reckon with a new, terrifying discovery. That when you stop moving and start fighting the world in one place, you can win the battle. But you might just destroy the entire war. They achieved their mastery just in time to watch the world they mastered simply vanish. Right before their eyes. You have to understand the terrible fundamental irony of the Clovis people. The name we gave this ghost culture because of a site in New Mexico. They achieved perfection in the tool, but they achieved stagnation in the spirit. When we talk about the Ghost March halting, we are talking about millions of square miles of continent suddenly inhabited by a people who had collectively decided this is enough. This mindset manifested in the most important artifact they left behind, an object of absolute beauty and terrifying efficiency, the fluted spear point. Imagine a technology that is so perfectly adapted to its environment that it doesn't need to change for centuries. In our modern chaotic world, that sounds like a miracle. To them, it was the necessary cost of survival in a vast, cold, indifferent landscape. The Clovis toolkit, those magnificent, symmetrical projectiles, scrapers and blades, are found scattered across the continent from coast to coast, yet they show almost no regional variation for hundreds of years. Think about that for a second. We're talking about an entire continent inhabited by humans who, culturally, seem to have been moving to the same beat. They shared the same knowledge, the same strategies, the same core implements. They were unified, not by conquest or empire, but by shared necessity. If you found a Clovis camp in Montana, you could instantly recognize the kill kit from a camp in Florida. This uniformity tells us something dark and profound about their journey. It means they had no room for innovation that deviated from the established blueprint. They had eliminated the chaos of exploration and replaced it with the rigid order of the perfect kill. Their lives revolved around specialized hunting, tracking the colossal, slow-moving megafauna, the mammoths, the mastodons, the great bison. They mastered the geography, mapping the continent in their heads, but only for the purpose of interception, not settlement. They had essentially declared war on the existing animal population, but in a highly regulated, almost ritualistic way. And it worked. The system provided. They were the apex predator in an Ice Age park, teeming with gigantic edible resources. But what happens when you pour all your cultural, technological, and spiritual energy into perfecting one single type of solution? You become tragically vulnerable to any problem that falls outside that specialty. We talk about their efficiency, but perhaps we should talk about their hubris. The archaeological record shows that right up until the catastrophic shifts, the Clovis people continued to manufacture and refine those perfect fluted points, even as the animals they were designed to kill were beginning to thin out. And this brings us to the great, terrifying uncertainty that defines this entire period. The end of the Pleistocene. Around 12,900 years ago, something truly cataclysmic happened. The world didn't ease into a new age, it crashed. Imagine you are living in a relatively stable world. Cold, yes, but predictable. And then, over the span of maybe a single lifetime, the temperature plunges back into near glacial conditions. This abrupt, massive cold snap is what academics call the Younger Dryas. It was a global shockwave, likely caused by the sudden draining of massive proglacial lakes like Lake Agassiz into the North Atlantic. This influx of fresh, cold water essentially shut down the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the gigantic ocean conveyor belt that pulls warm water north and keeps the northern hemisphere habitable. When the Gulf Stream faltered, the thermostat broke. The climate went haywire. You, as a Clovis hunter, suddenly woke up to a reality where the weather wasn't just cold, it was unstable, violent, and utterly unpredictable. The grasslands and spruce forests where your prey grazed vanished, replaced by arid scrub and tundra. The world they had painstakingly mapped and conquered turned into a hostile stranger overnight. The system stopped working. We see the evidence in the archaeological layers, a sudden and definitive shift. The Clovis culture, that unified ghost consciousness, doesn't simply evolve, it vanishes. It shatters into numerous, distinct, and highly stressed regional groups. We call them post-Clovis or Folsom, depending on location. But the shattering of the culture was nothing compared to the shattering of the ecosystem. The great giants, the megafauna, the very foundation of the Clovis diet, began their spectacular, heartbreaking slide into oblivion. Mammoth bones ceased to appear in the record, not gradually, but almost all at once. The giant sloths, the ancient horses, they were gone. Now, we must step carefully here. There is still fervent academic debate about why these animals disappeared. Was it purely climate? The shock of the Younger Dryas wiped out their food sources. Or was it overhunting by the hyper-efficient Clovis spear? The most rigorous, evidence-based consensus suggests it was a devastating confluence. The Clovis people were the stressor. The climate shock was the executioner. They had honed their craft to exploit these animals, and when the climate started pulling the rug out from under the ecosystem, the pressure applied by those perfect fluted points was the last shove the giants needed. Imagine the horror. You rely on an animal the size of a small house for meat and hides. You have perfected the ritual of its slaughter. And then, one season, you track the familiar migration route, and they are not there. Or worse, you find them starving, their massive bodies too specialized to cope with the sudden, brutal shift in vegetation. Your entire survival manual, passed down through generations of tireless marching and meticulous observation, is now toilet paper. The spear point that was your pride and power is now useless because the giants are dead and the world is freezing around you. The ultimate irony of their stagnation was that they had stopped moving. They had committed themselves to specific regions, specific hunting grounds. When the ice returned, they couldn't simply pack up and continue the ghost march south. They were trapped in pockets of environmental collapse. If the Younger Dryas was a climate catastrophe, then for the Clovis people it felt like an apocalypse. And for some hypotheses, backed by controversial but persistent evidence found in the sediments, nanodiamonds, microscopic spheres of carbon, it might have been exactly that. We are talking about widespread chaos, fires raging across North America, vast ice sheets collapsing, dust storms blocking the sun. It wasn't just a cold winter. It was the entire continent undergoing a violent geological temper tantrum. And the people who had stopped moving, who had decided, here's the end, were now facing a world that was truly ending. They had finally achieved mastery over their environment, just in time to watch that environment implode, leaving them stranded, shivering, and watching their food sources become ghosts right before their eyes. The world had ended, and they were standing in the aftermath, realizing they were the last ones left to clean up the ghosts of the great animals they had once hunted. And then, the surviving humans had to reckon with the impossible. How do you survive when the world you knew is suddenly dead and the only proof that you were ever there is a beautifully fluted, utterly useless stone shard? That beautiful, utterly useless stone shard You hold it up, or rather, we look at the evidence left behind the magnificent fluted Clovis Point, and you see the perfect expression of human genius, tailored for an environment that ceased to exist almost instantly. This wasn't just a tool, it was a mission statement. It said, we are the apex predator. We hunt the biggest things on Earth. And then the biggest things on Earth were gone. Imagine the cognitive dissonance. Everything your culture valued, every story your elders told, every skill your father taught you suddenly becomes obsolete, a dangerous liability. You are perfectly equipped for a battlefield that has dissolved into mist. The Younger Dryas didn't just bring cold, it brought the Great Silence. We talk about the extinction of the megafauna almost clinically, referencing academic papers and carbon dating. But try, just for a moment, to pull the camera back and see the human reality of it. It wasn't just the majestic mammoths and mastodons, the walking mountains of protein, that vanished. It was the entire ecosystem that preyed upon them, fed off them, or competed with them. The mighty short-faced bear, 3 times the size of a modern grizzly. The enormous ground sloths, taller than a giraffe, that once shaped the landscape just by grazing. The terrifying dire wolves, the saber-toothed cats. They all became ghosts, and you, the surviving human, were left living in a museum dedicated to their absence. When you look at the archaeological record from that pivotal moment, the transition from the Clovis period to what comes next, it's not a record of failure, but a record of profound, desperate triage. It's the story of people looking around a dead, silent landscape and saying, we cannot keep moving. The food source we followed has ended the march for us. Think about the sheer scale of the caloric disaster. A single successful mammoth hunt could feed a band of 50 people for weeks. It provided meat, hide for massive tents, bone for tools. It was the backbone of their exploratory lifestyle, allowing them the luxury of travel. When that disappears, you don't just lose food, you lose your entire economic model. Suddenly, that expertly fluted point, that masterpiece that required incredible skill to nap, is too heavy, too thick, too specialized. You can't waste that much high-quality chert on a tiny, fast-moving pronghorn antelope or a nervous rabbit. The energy expenditure is too high. The survivors had to learn a new, humbling lesson. Forget the glory kill. Forget the seismic thud of the colossal beast. Learn to be small again. This is where the ghost march fractured. If you can't feed a large group with one massive kill, you must fragment. The bands break apart. They move away from the centralized hunting grounds, which are now deserts of ice and dust, and start burrowing into smaller, more localized ecological niches. We see this change reflected perfectly in the next phase of tools. Look at the Folsom Point, which emerges shortly after the Clovis period collapses. It's elegant, yes, but thinner, lighter, and designed not for the mighty mammoth, but for the huge, but far faster ancestor of the modern bison. The focus narrows, the scale shrinks. They were still magnificent hunters, make no mistake, but their sights were lower. They were adapting, desperately trying to map their survival onto a patchwork of resources. Smaller mammals, waterfowl, fish, and crucially, gathering whatever meager plants could survive the freezing climate. This shift from the specialized hunter, the Paleo-Indian ideal, to the generalized forager is the death knell of the Great March. When you are reliant on seasonal berries, small game, and localized water sources, you cannot afford to wander vast distances. You must know your territory intimately, down to every root and sheltered crevice. Exploration becomes a liability. Stability becomes the only goal. The horizon, which had symbolized infinite possibility just a few generations earlier, suddenly became a symbol of dangerous uncertainty. Beyond the familiar valley might lay only ice, starvation, and the remains of dead giants. Why risk it? This, perhaps, is the true tragedy we find etched in the soil of North America around 11,500 years ago. Not just the death of the animals, but the death of the will to explore. They had successfully colonized the world's most challenging continent, proved they could survive anything, only to have the continent itself send them a terrifying message. You are confined now. And so, the vast cultural network, the shared technology, the common language of stone tools that linked groups thousands of miles apart began to unravel. The shared identity of the great travelers splintered into hundreds of tiny, resilient, but fiercely territorial groups. The survivors began perfecting the art of staying put. They stopped moving south and instead started digging in, creating the foundations for what would become the remarkably diverse and deeply rooted indigenous cultures of North America. They began crafting tools not just for hunting, but for processing, grinding, and building. A profound psychological shift. The Ghost March was over, not because they reached a barrier, but because the engine of their migration, the expectation of bounty and the confidence to find it, had seized up and died. They settled in the aftermath, shivering, staring at the frozen soil, trying to figure out how to catch a fish when their tools were designed to kill a giant. And in this settling, in this decision to stop seeking the unknown and instead to master the immediate dangerous known, they created a new kind of human being. A human being whose survival depended entirely on the brutal, localized fact that the whole world had ended and they were the ones who had to figure out how to make a meager life out of the wreckage. But settling meant surviving, and survival demanded one thing above all else that the great explorers had never needed: deep, intimate, territorial knowledge. They had to forge a relationship with the land that wasn't about passing through, but about belonging. And that belonging came with a new set of dangers that were much more human than the ice and the dust. Dangers that arose the moment two desperate groups tried to claim the same small, safe patch of wreckage. They were no longer defined by the Ghost March, but by the border they now had to defend. And history, as we know, is rarely kind to those who settle down right next to others who are starving. The Ghost March ended when they traded their maps for fences. Think about that for a second. Really put yourself in that freezing, exhausted moment. When you're a nomad, your survival is fluid. If the water dries up here, you move there. If the hunting fails, you follow the herds. Your investment is in your skills, your culture, and the muscle memory of movement. You own nothing but what you can carry, and therefore nothing you own can hold you hostage. But the moment the decision was made, the terrible, magnificent decision to stop, everything changed. You had to invest in the spot. You had to plant, not just forage. You had to build permanent shelter, not just temporary tents. You had to put down roots, literally and metaphorically. And that is the core vulnerability of the settler. When you pour your labor, your hope, and your children's future into one single, non-portable patch of earth, that patch ceases to be merely a resource. It becomes an extension of your body, an organ of survival. If someone threatens the single water source, they aren't just thirsty, they are trying to rip the lungs out of your community. This is why the supposed idyllic peace of the first agricultural settlements, the moment humans supposedly mastered nature, is a myth, a romantic fiction we like to tell ourselves. When we actually look at the archaeological record, when we dig into the layers of mud and burned timber that marked those first attempts at permanence, we find something far messier, something truly heartbreaking. We find proof that the first great invention after farming wasn't the wheel, or pottery, or writing. It was the invention of territorial organized violence. It was the fence and the weapon designed specifically to put down another human being trying to cross that fence. Consider the data. When humans were primarily nomadic hunter-gatherers, conflicts certainly existed. There were individual disputes, quick raids, and skirmishes, usually over specific spoils or interpersonal insults. But the evidence for large-scale systematic warfare is surprisingly sparse. Nomads rarely had the time, the population density, or the motive to engage in blood feuds that lasted generations. They could simply move away. But the settler, the farmer, they are trapped. And the second problem arose immediately. Everybody was desperate, and everybody was settling near the same places. You see, the Ghost March stopped because certain pockets of the world offered predictable, rich, post-Ice Age environments. River valleys, fertile crescents, coastal marshlands. These were the only places worth the monumental risk of permanence. So you, the tired migrant, finally carve out your perfect little valley. You clear the stones, you sow the seeds, and you breathe a sigh of relief. You believe the march is over. Then, a few seasons later, your scouts return with terrified eyes. They tell you that 3 days upstream, another massive starving group, one that also decided this was the end of the world, is doing the exact same thing. And their population is growing faster than yours. The shared resource suddenly becomes a finite resource. The river that nourishes your fields starts to look like the boundary line that must be defended with sharpened sticks and rocks. What archaeology reveals from sites dating to this transition, the late Mesolithic moving into the Neolithic across various continents, is a chilling uniformity. We see the rapid rise of defensive architecture, palisades, ditches, earthen mounds built not to keep out bears, but to keep out other humans. We find villages that show signs of sudden, catastrophic burning, followed by immediate, often less sophisticated, rebuilding, the signature of a devastating raid. And then there are the people themselves. We examine the skeletons. We stop looking for injuries caused by falling off a cliff or being gored by a mammoth. We start looking for something precise. Cranial trauma, inflicted by bludgeoning instruments perfectly calibrated to shatter a skull in one blow, or embedded stone projectile points, arrowheads, lodged squarely in the spine, not the thigh or the shoulder, but places designed to instantly incapacitate or kill. There are massacre sites, places where dozens of individuals, often women and children included, were executed and dumped into pits. Think about the tragedy. These people had survived the longest, most brutal migration in human history, navigating glaciers, deserts, and impossible odds. They made it to the finish line, only to be slaughtered by their neighbors over a patch of dirt. The cost of stopping was that your enemy was no longer the environment. It was simply the person next to you who was slightly hungrier. This pressure cooker environment required a massive psychological shift. The explorer identity, which valued cooperation, movement, and resource sharing, had to die. It was replaced by the settler identity, possessive, fearful, and increasingly reliant on hierarchy and specialized violence. You needed leaders who could organize a defense, men who dedicated their lives not to farming or hunting, but to the grim, specialized art of killing other humans efficiently. The Ghost March gave birth to us, but the settling gave birth to war. And once that mechanism of territorial violence is activated, once you build that first wall and commit that first retaliatory massacre, there is no going back. You are locked into a cycle defined by the fear of loss. You must protect the harvest you spent all season cultivating, because if you lose it, you starve. Your neighbor knows you have it, and they are also starving. The calculation is brutally simple, and it dictates everything from your religious rites to your marriage laws. This isn't just about small fights anymore. We start seeing evidence of what amounts to organized, sustained conflict. We see the establishment of designated burial grounds specifically for the war dead, marked by wounds that speak volumes about systemic violence. They are no longer just defending the immediate border. They are launching preemptive strikes. They are attempting to eliminate the threat entirely. The explorers had solved the problem of the whole world. The settlers were now forced to solve the terrifying problem of their immediate backyard. And the solution they settled on, time and time again, was to ensure that the other group failed, even if it meant risking their own destruction in the process. This relentless, localized warfare wasn't just a consequence of settling, it was the foundation of the first true civilizations. Because only through this constant, agonizing defense of their critical zone did they begin to develop the complex social structures, the stored wealth, and the population concentration necessary to truly dominate the landscape. But domination always comes at a price. And for the early settlers, that price was their humanity. It forced them to accept a new, frightening truth, that the survival of your tribe might depend entirely on the permanent, deliberate erasure of another. And you had to figure out who was next on the list of people you needed to stop existing right now, before they figured out how to come over your wall. You see that wall we just built? The one designed to permanently erase the threat from the outside? It's not just a defensive structure, it's a leash. We were forced, through sheer, painful necessity, to develop complexity in order to survive the constant threat of neighboring groups who also needed the river, who also needed the fertile soil, who also needed to know who was coming over their wall. But that complexity, while saving us from immediate extinction, installed a new, heavy set of chains forged from logistics and bureaucracy. Think about the sheer weight of organization required to sustain that siege mentality year after year, generation after generation. To build the walls, you need thousands of laborers. To feed the laborers while they are building, you need centralized grain storage. To organize the grain storage, you need accountants and scribes who aren't planting or fighting, but simply counting. To enforce the rules that keep the grain safe and the workers compliant, you need organized authority, a chief, a king, a priesthood. This is the moment, right here, where the true cost of civilization slams into us. We traded the simple, direct burden of survival, where if you failed, you packed up and moved, for the immensely complex, suffocating burden of management. We are no longer just people. We are now cogs in a colossal machine dedicated almost entirely to preserving itself. And that machine is fragile. If the nomad fails, they lose a few animal skins and perhaps a season's foraging. They recover quickly. They remain mobile. But if the settler fails, if the walls are breached, if the irrigation ditches silt up, if the stored wealth is lost, you lose everything. The massive complex infrastructure that took decades of forced labor and strict social control to build. This investment, this gargantuan commitment to permanence, created a paralyzing fear of loss that the nomad never understood. The land ceased to be a pathway to somewhere else. It became an immutable asset, an anchor, a burden you simply could not abandon. And this psychological shift is what fundamentally altered the human experiment. Remember that relentless push we talked about? The instinct to find out what was over the next hill. The drive that sent us crawling out of Africa and across continents, across frozen straits, just because we could. That impulse dies the moment the centralized state begins to demand every single resource for internal defense and maintenance. Why would the king of Uruk, already struggling to feed his thousands of inhabitants and defend against his rival city-state a few miles downriver, spend his most valuable resource, fit young men, sending them off on a year-long expedition into the complete unknown? Tactically, it's insane. It's not just a waste, it's a deliberate crippling of the immediate defensive capability. Every resource, every ounce of collective willpower, every organized skill was immediately diverted inward. Exploration stopped being the highest human endeavor. It became a terrible, illogical, tactical error. The horizon became irrelevant because the greatest threat and the greatest opportunity was already contained within the immediate critical zone of your fortified settlement. Look at the evidence we pull from those early urban centers. The early Mesopotamian statues, the terracotta faces. They don't look like joyous conquerors of the earth. They look deeply anxious, wide-eyed, exhausted. They are tethered to the soil by deep, heavy roots of commitment. The silos of stored grain, the enormous temple complexes dedicated to justifying the king's power, the family grave sites, the complex web of social debt and specialization. The comfort they fought so agonizingly hard to secure became the most effective cage ever invented. They needed the walls to survive, but the walls needed an army, and the army needed a king, and the king needed compliance, and compliance needed an administration, and that administration demanded a lifetime of labor tied to one spot. We lost our footloose freedom, that glorious, terrifying mobility, in exchange for stability, and stability, once achieved, is the hardest thing in the world to break away from. Once you have built your life around a 50-foot thick mud brick wall, telling everyone to pack up and leave to cross the desert for an idea is treasonous madness. We, the descendants of the ultimate global explorers, suddenly decided that the physical journey was over. We chose permanence. We accepted the claustrophobic reality that survival meant looking inwards, forever refining the small space we controlled rather than expanding into the vastness. The physical march stopped. The great continental migration shuddered to a halt. The impulse didn't vanish entirely, of course. That's not how human nature works. Instead, it mutated. If you couldn't walk across the continent, you walked deeper into complexity. They built their world higher and deeper, investing incredible energy into making the enclosed space infinitely complex, infinitely detailed, and infinitely regulated. The greatest journey ceased to be the exploration of the unknown wilderness. The greatest journey became the trip from the marketplace to the temple, or the journey through the rigid social strata of the state. This is the invisible turning point. This is the collective decision point thousands of years ago, where humanity took one last, long, agonizing look at the terrifying emptiness of the uncharted world, looked back at the warmth and safety of the fortified, organized city, and collectively whispered, "We are done walking." We had found the perfect defensive position. We had perfected the art of staying put. But in doing so, we had killed the driving force that defined our species for millions of years. And what happens to a creature built for perpetual, relentless movement when it finally decides, against every instinct, that the destination has already been reached? What happens when the Ghost March is abandoned, not by a single tribe, but by every organized human community at once? The silence that followed was terrifying, because the space they stopped exploring, the emptiness, was still out there, and it was getting ready to swallow everything they had worked so hard to build. The silence was horrifying, because it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of anticipation. Think about what happens when an organism designed to move violently jams itself into a fixed defensive posture. It starts to consume itself. The energy that was supposed to propel us across the next ridge, that drive to find the next river or the next untouched valley, that energy didn't just vanish. It folded inward. We didn't stop because we had failed. We stopped because, ironically, we had succeeded too well. We had built things so complex, so interdependent, cities, trade networks, bureaucratic hierarchies, that the sheer maintenance required every ounce of collective willpower. The risk-to-reward ratio for exploration flipped catastrophically. Why send a costly, vulnerable expedition into the hostile wilds when every available laborer is needed to maintain the irrigation canals that feed the 3,000 people already inside the walls? The moment we truly stopped walking, we invented the concept of the foreigner, not as a curiosity, but as an existential threat. Look at the archaeological record, and you don't see a slow, graceful decline. You see a sudden, aggressive retraction. We are talking about the massive civilizations of the late Bronze Age, the sprawling, connected superhighway of humanity that spanned the Mediterranean and the Near East. For centuries, the Hittite kings traded letters with the pharaohs. Mycenaean merchants were drinking wine alongside Babylonian scribes. It was a globalized world, just like ours, built entirely on the confidence that the movement, the march, would continue and that the next port would be friendly. Then, around 1200 BCE, the lights went out. It wasn't a slow dimming. It was a blackout so total, so widespread, that historians still argue violently about the single catastrophic spark that caused it. But maybe the mistake is looking for a spark. Maybe the spark was merely the symptom of the fuel running out. The fuel being the human will to endure the discomfort of the unknown. When the Ghost March was abandoned, we didn't just stop expanding. We started forgetting. And this is perhaps the most terrifying cost of settling down, the collective cultural amnesia. The sophisticated knowledge, how to build the specific colossal ships for deep-sea trade, how to create the complex administrative systems necessary to manage a 4,000-mile trade route, how to write down literature, all this complex, fragile information was suddenly deemed non-essential to survival inside the walls. If the world outside is irrelevant, why bother teaching your children how to read the maps of that irrelevant world? You can see it in the pottery, in the architecture, and especially in the script. Highly detailed written languages, like Mycenaean Linear B, vanish entirely. Centuries of literary tradition, diplomatic protocols, and economic complexity are simply filed away in an administrative office that nobody tends to anymore, until the office burns down and the knowledge is gone forever. We didn't just lose the ability to march forward, we actively destroyed the records of how far we had already come. The Great Retreat was a strategic, intellectual, scorched earth policy. And here is the crucial, painful twist. The decision to stop walking did not, in fact, eliminate risk. It merely confined all the risks, hunger, disease, conflict, into a much smaller, denser space. We had achieved maximum density inside the walls and maximum fragility. When the climate shifts inevitably occurred, and the academic consensus points strongly toward massive droughts and shifting rainfall patterns across the Fertile Crescent around that same time, the great cities had zero adaptive capacity left. The Ghost Marchers had always adapted by pivoting, by moving to where the water was. But the settled people? Their entire civilization was engineered for the water to come to them. And when the rivers shrunk, when the grain fields withered, the pressure inside the walls became unbearable. You can't tell tens of thousands of people confined within perfect high defensive walls that they need to pack up and walk 500 miles to find a new place to start farming. That instinct, the marching instinct, had been bred out of them. They were prisoners of their own success. The massive trade networks that once brought copper from Cyprus to the Aegean now became conduits for starvation and desperation. The fear we had tried to wall out finally materialized, but it didn't come from the deep unknown. It came from the known, immediate neighbors who were just as hungry as we were. This is where the mythology of the sea peoples truly begins. Forget the simplistic image of barbarians coming to sack civilizations. Archaeology suggests something far more complex, frightening, and human. These peoples were, in many cases, highly organized populations, our own kin, displaced, starving, and now marching again, but without the curiosity or the grand strategy of the original Ghost Marchers. They weren't looking for a new home. They were looking to take ours. We had convinced ourselves that stopping the forward march meant we were safe. We were wrong. We had merely paused, while the relentless universe, the chaotic, beautiful emptiness we had fled, continued to move. And now, that chaotic movement was slamming into the rigid, brittle shell we had built around ourselves. The Ghost March was over, but the reckoning was just beginning, and it wasn't the vast, open future that terrified us anymore. It was the sudden, undeniable understanding that we had spent all our energy building a perfect cage, and the key to that cage was the marching instinct we had thrown away. The walls we built were magnificent, the highest ever constructed by human hands. But you must ask yourself, when a wall is perfected, is it meant to keep the threats out, or is it meant to keep the inhabitants in? And as the great, organized, settled civilizations crumbled one by one into centuries of Dark Age silence, a final essential question hung over the ruins. waiting for the few survivors to understand its terrifying implications. If we refused to march to the end of the world, what terrible consequences would eventually march back to us? It wasn't a single army that marched back to us, you see. It wasn't a barbarian horde or an organized enemy wielding superior steel. It was something far more horrifying, far more inevitable. What marched back was consequence. It was the terrifying, undeniable reality that we had spent centuries perfecting stability. And you know what history tells us about stability? It's a myth. It's an unsustainable dream held together by thin threads of cooperation and complex, highly specialized logistics. We had built an ecosystem, a delicate scaffolding of interdependence, where the copper mined in Cyprus was essential for the bronze forged in Mycenae, which was necessary to arm the soldiers protecting the grain grown in Egypt, whose ships needed the timber from Lebanon. Every single point on that elaborate, magnificent map of settled civilization was tied to every other point. When the Ghost March ended and we all decided this is the boundary, we created a single global failure point. The archaeologists call it the Late Bronze Age collapse. We should call it the Reckoning. Around 1200 BCE, the lights went out across the civilized world. Not gradually, not slowly, but like someone flicked a global switch. You have to understand the sheer comprehensive trauma of this event. Palaces that had stood for generations, centers of bureaucracy, wealth, and culture. Ugarit, Knossos, Troy, Mycenae, the great Hittite capital of Hattusa. They burned. They didn't just burn. The complex system that fed, governed, and justified them simply evaporated. You ask, who did this? We can point fingers at the Sea Peoples, those mysterious groups that sailed down the Levantine coast, hitting Egypt like a tidal wave. But the most terrifying academic consensus suggests these weren't just foreign invaders. These were us. These were fragmented elements of the system, refugees, displaced farmers, mercenaries whose pay had stopped, desperate people who suddenly found their specialized roles irrelevant because the global trade network, the circulatory system of the settled world, had seized up. Look at the facts. Sediment cores from the period show sustained, severe droughts gripping the Near East. The fields didn't produce. The wells dried up. Famine hits. Then internal conflict flares. People who had been specialized potters or scribes suddenly realized their survival depended on the most basic, brutal human skill, taking what someone else had. And when the walls we had perfected finally failed, what did the survivors do? Did they look out at the ruins and say, "All right, let's start the march again. Let's find new lands and build a different, more resilient future"? No, they didn't. That was the final, tragic surrender of the Ghost March. Instead of marching out, the survivors marched inward. They retreated into fortified hamlets. The complex, beautiful art and writing systems, the Linear B script of the Mycenaeans, the cuneiform tablets of Ugarit, they vanished. Literacy plummeted. The high priests and kings, the administrators and architects were replaced by local strongmen ruling small, isolated territories. We, the survivors, entered the Dark Ages. For centuries, across vast swathes of the globe, from the Greek mainland to the Anatolian plateau, human ambition shrank down to the size of a single village. We forgot how to build magnificent stone structures. We forgot how to administer large empires. We even forgot how to bury our dead with the dignity and complexity we once afforded them. The specialized knowledge that defines civilization, metallurgy, advanced navigation, large-scale engineering, it didn't just stop developing. Much of it was lost entirely. This is the ultimate answer to the question of the Ghost March, isn't it? The cost of stopping. When we gave up the nomadic instinct, that relentless, sometimes frightening desire to see what was over the next horizon, we gave up our resilience. The journey, the march, forces you to be adaptable. It keeps you lean, light, and focused on essential survival. But the great settled civilizations, they became fat, burdened by bureaucracy, fragile because every element depended on every other element working perfectly. We built magnificent walls to defend against the threat we thought was outside. But the true threat was the brittleness we cultivated inside the walls. And here we are, looking back across the millennia at that long, silent period. The Ghost March taught us that there is a profound, almost biological impulse within us to keep moving, to keep seeking the next challenge. When that impulse is suppressed, when an entire species decides the job is done, the subsequent stagnation is corrosive. You might argue that later civilizations, Rome, the age of exploration, restarted the march, and yes, they did, temporarily. But the ghost, march itself, that primal species-level drive to simply populate the entire planet for no reason other than that we can, that spirit was broken in the wreckage of the Bronze Age collapse. It changed our relationship with the world. We stopped seeing the world as an endless frontier and started seeing it as a resource to be controlled, managed, and walled off. We substituted exploration for extraction and adaptability for rigid controls. Look at the ancient ruins, those vast empty fields of stone and dust. They are the monuments to the ultimate historical lesson. The moment we declared the frontier closed, the Ghost March became less about finding a new home and more about trying to remember why we needed one in the first place. The walls are down now, reduced to foundations waiting for the archaeologist's trowel. The fear of the unknown that had driven us for millennia has been replaced by the quiet terror of knowing too much, of understanding precisely how high the cost of surrender truly was. We are still here, you and I, products of those survivors who huddled in the ruins. We inherited their broken memory, the knowledge that we once belonged to a race that spanned continents, defined not by what it built, but by where it was going. The Ghost March ended, the reckoning came, and the world was left with the silence of a history that should have kept moving. And as we stare into the deep, dark history of humanity, we are forced to ask ourselves, if the journey is over, what terrible consequences are we inviting to march back to us now? The final chilling truth of the Ghost March isn't found in the steps we took, but in the countless paths we collectively refused to walk. And in that refusal, we found the end of the world, not on the horizon, but right where we stood.